The next session, we're going to talk about organizational reference data implementation. So Lauren, Hickey, and Kara Stringer and I are going to be tag teaming this briefing. I'm going to start with the geospatial data, even though it's kind of, it's not the center of all of it. It is a big part of it. And I think everyone's tracking the organizational reference data. But like I said, those two are going to give you information about how it's going to be set up between OIS or combined into Edge. And then I'm going to talk about the geospatial data. So without further ado, maybe people are aware, but the data management program now manages the national base layers. So in the past, this was taken over by one of the agencies. I don't know who was before Jill Kinsey, but she was with the Forest Service. And so
Diana.
Oh, Diana. Okay. So it's been kind of passed around from agency to agency. Diana was with BLM, but was never really central. But now that we have the DMP, it can be a job instead of like, a secondary role for someone. It can be really focused on. So the layers that are now included are the GAT boundaries, federal dispatch boundaries, dispatch office location, initial attack frequency zones for U.S. and international protective services area, and jurisdictional boundaries. Jurisdictional boundaries are treated a little bit differently, but these are really core data that Wildland Fire owns and manages. So the way that we're managing them now is pretty separate. It is completely separate from the UnitID and the OIS data. So there's a lot of coordination, verbal, phone calls, email that's involved. But I took over this job in January, and this is the first quarter that I've been working on it. But just seeing the way that the process is done, it's a lot of manpower, and it can be more efficient. So right now, I won't go through the exact workflow, but basically updating is a manual process. On this last slide, I showed Alaska here because we had a combination. So the Yukon Fire Dispatch Center combined multiple dispatch centers into one, and then now there's a ACDC, which is a great name for a dispatch center. That was combined in the south there. So this is kind of how it works. Like I'll get an email from the authoritative data source or the dispatch center. Hopefully, sometimes I get it from a geospatial person. They're like, we want to combine these dispatch centers into this one, and here's the kind of the boundary we want to change. And I'll say, okay. And I don't know what happened before the changes I make to the geospatial data, but I'm changing the UnitID to a whole new UnitID. And I know that's being done by multiple other people. So there's a lot of people in the process, and then technology probably isn't being used as best as it could. So I put a little baby on the bottom left-hand corner because I think that this is the crawl process of this process. See with the little diaper there. Yeah, we're gonna go right to walking. There was a little table. Yeah, so that's the way I see it next. I'm kind of borrowing off what we're doing with the WIFIGs and the idea of having, and IDME and all of what's coming is, using ETLs, using Edge. So I would like, once we have this organizational data, reference data that we're talking about in Edge, that those changes, like the dispatch UnitID for the Kenai interagency, the changes to ACDC, that would happen all in Edge. So, the authoritative data source would go in, make the change. That's the master data. And then I would get an email. So I'm here. I don't have any hair, but no one does. So I have some. So I'm in the middle. That's the national base layer editor. Maybe just initially I get a tip or a cue that there's been a change in Edge, and I have to go in and look at it. And that's good. That's easier than it is now, because right now all the emails and calls and it's just not very easy. So that would be how I would get the data, and then I would update it to the layers in the NIFC, or the layers that feed the open data site and the business research public. Everyone can access it there. So that's the walking. So that's why I have that person walking. And then the next phase would be the running. So this is the long term, and this would be the authoritative data source makes the change in edge. That's, like I said, the organizational reference data. Then an API, instead of, an email, sends the data to not me in the middle, but FME or an ETL tool or Matillion, whatever that is in the middle, IDME, it's EGP. We won't go into the how, but that's going to happen without a human in the loop as long as we have a GUID in the organizational data, reference data, or something to know that this record is the same as this one, so we can start updating the geospatial data. And then it goes into the NIFC open data site, the NIFC work, data marketplace, whatever. So connecting these geospatial data layers to organizational data is very high on my agenda and is, now I think within reach, making it more streamlined. Questions?
Yeah, I have one, because, I mean, sometimes we can't just kill a dispatch center because maybe Viper resource, like Bozeman lived on for like a year and a half because the Viper
The
resources
are still there.
stuck. Yeah,
Yeah,
and so you can't just kill them. But
yeah, I don't think so.
Spatially, it took a year and a half to get that one done, and then that one ACDC, it's taken them almost a year to get all those records cleaned up as well. So you can't just kill them in the systems. And we wait to make sure all the resources have been removed from those before we kill them in the UnitID or OAS.
Yeah, I don't want to kill them. I'm just thinking, and you could have a unique identifier that, and with a status that's like, not active, but still has resources, or, something that we could flag if you're not ready to take, either you're not ready to take
It
it
still
out
has
of
to
the
be active
source.
in IROC.
Yeah, and then
Right,
maybe
right.
it feeds the geospatial, but comes out of the geospatial, or like we could have options for all
Yeah, I
three.
think Jill did something with Bozeman. She fixed it on the geospatial side, but we had to have it live on
Yeah,
for
And-
another year.
And from the perspective of how that organizational ID is identified in reference data or in UnitID or in anywhere else, it would still function so that it doesn't break your system. But from a mapping perspective, because it's no longer part of the matrix, then to avoid breaking the map,
Right.
they can go ahead and be.
I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not always as smooth as we'd like.
Oh,
yeah.
Agreed.
So, and I think we capture that in the process of, what's not smooth and what,
Yeah,
how do we make sure that.
just, there's a lot of moving parts sometimes.
And I feel bad, just so that everybody knows, so Emmy was not supposed to go first, but my computer wouldn't stop spinning. And so we're kind of out of order. And so what you're saying will probably cover as to how those processes work, where we make. So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So my bad, my computer wouldn't stop spinning. So I was like, Emmy, will you go
Did
first?
we start it?
I'm good, yeah.
Yes.
Just one quick question about this, is I know, in the current process, when you kind of retire the organization centers, the unit identifier goes away in the data. It's no longer in OIS, it's, and then it comes out of IROC, which is causing us problems because Irwin is using unit identifiers for organizations, like say, if I'm pushing a request, I need to pass the unit identifier for that organization.
We don't delete them.
And if that were to come out of the reference data, then that would be a problem for mapping old stuff.
So we don't delete them. We deactivate them in the
Yeah.
system.
Right, so the orgs get deactivated, but the unit identifier, at least between OIS to IROC, gets taken out.
So it's.
And that may be on the service level.
And the
Yeah,
new
the
system
system
should not, I
You would
guess I'm
know
just
that.
saying, the new system, we need to make sure that that does
Yeah.
not carry over from that.
Sure.
Because it shouldn't.
Right.
Gina?
Well, that's how OAS was designed.
Yeah.
I can still restore them.
Okay.
They're still there. You just don't see them, but they're still there. Like I could reactivate them and then UnitID would come back to life, just like we did with one. Okay. So,
But you say inactive, it hides it.
yes.
Yeah, but they're not deleted. They
No.
still exist in a table
That's
in
correct.
that program somewhere.
Okay, so they do still have the.
Yeah, but it's,
in there.
yeah, but.
But why not visible to you?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of it too, right? Yeah, that makes sense. we're doing some data cleanup.
Yeah.
On stuff that's a little historical, 4 years old. Um, And so of course, those unit IDs aren't available anymore. They're no longer active, but they were at the time.
Yeah.
And they were valid.
Like, for example, well, here's a real historical one. For example, there was a unit identifier for Western Great Basin, which no longer exists, but it hasn't been deleted. It just isn't being used anymore. It's from a historical perspective.
So I think the big thing with this is that getting this mapping from the geospatial side, like, that's been a challenge, right? And it's a fairly common occurrence that geospatial data gets managed differently than all of the rest of the data, right? And we know that we're talking about points on the ground, like geospatial is so central to everything we do. We're really trying to break down that line and look at how we manage all of our data. And in a lot of our layers, those attributes on those layers are data element standards. And so, you know, this organizational component is one of the first forays into how is it that we actually keep our spatial data synchronized with the data, the master data that's being created in other places and our reference data, right? So it seems weird, like in one way, because it's all talking about the same stuff, but there has been historically some real separation in that. And so we're just trying to kind of walk through some of that with this organizational data.
Yeah, and if Edge does have a geospatial capability, but it's different than how we're using it. So we thought about starting, you know, having the geospatial data in Edge. It doesn't work the way doesn't seem like it's gonna work the way we need it.
Right. We want the metadata, but not the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the polygon and just the way that we've been doing it. And so anyway, that's all I had on the geospatial.
Do you mind if I show something really quick that's kind of like what we're talking about? And it's sort of applicable. Let me share my screen. Right.
And thank you for jumping up and going first. While
Yeah,
her computer
you're
had the
welcome.
technical challenges, we really,
And
the flexibility was awesome.
Chris Strobel has his hand up, so.
Chris.
Hey, sorry to interrupt the flow there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one thing that we've been trying to explore in the Forest Service with regards to this topic is seeing in terms of like interacting with applications when we have this master list of organizations, even going to the spatial data as the authoritative source and using that geospatial data as the basically use geoprocessing application to basically, you know, take that current boundary and you have a date timestamp on that boundary, that spatial data, and you intersect that with your, I don't know, your fire boundary, and it stamps and, you know, puts it into the database rather than anybody having to hand enter an org code or a name of something. We're trying to move in that direction to reduce the data entry burden. I don't know if that's something that would fit, but to me, in my mind, that's getting towards taking that geospatial and tabular side and trying to move them together and use this power of geospatial to actually start populating data in the tabular non-geospatial systems.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm saying at the API, that ETL portion, I think.
On the right
I think
Oh, yeah.
on his side, he's saying they're doing geospatial first.
Yeah, right.
And then,
And then taking the tabular out, yeah.
So the spatial is the authority, and it just is, you're basically intersecting that with whatever layer, you know, other spatial layer you want to attach some organizational information to. Maybe it doesn't work, like for some of your data systems, if there isn't a spatial layer like a project area boundary. I mean, you've got the fire boundary and other boundaries, but yeah, I just thought I'd throw that in the room and see if that's something you had been thinking about at all.
Yeah, I thought of it when I created the slides, and that's what, when I used to work at the Air Force, we had a common installation picture. We always started with the geospatial and then got the tabular out. And I guess we do that with the National Incident Feature Service, but in this case, managing this data in Edge, I think overrides the geospatial component, but it could be a blend.
Well, I think it's, I mean, there's probably there's some historical precedents, right? In
Yeah.
the way we create unit IDs. And because it's bringing multiple agencies together, right? So we've worked really hard to mature that governance process. And I think too, that's part of that legacy of that separation between the spatial data and this tabular data, right? But I think that we've used reference data, spatial data to like populate data in applications. We're trying to move that direction. It probably is a transitionary process, and we may end up in that the management of the organizational data is managing a layer that then, but I don't know. And part of it is just understanding all of the metadata that goes along with that, Chris.
And the inherently spatial nature of the data you're talking about, like
Yeah,
dispatch boundary is inherently geospatial. I mean, it's a boundary.
Yeah.
I think most of the data about organizations is spatial, except for the roles that they play in the environment, right? And
Yeah.
so,
Back boundary.
I think there's a lot of cellular association with that, because once again,
Yeah.
some of these are full interagency. You're not gonna have a dispatch, I mean, even if you have, everyone agrees, here's the dispatch boundary, but within that dispatch boundary, there are 15 agencies
yeah,
with different needs and points of those things. Having a physical office located within that area doesn't mean that they're not still unique to a point. You know, they literally are a point. Some of these addresses are literally a point. It's not a, granted, you can derive certain things from layer. You can't just click on a layer and say, give me the unit ID, because probably your places can be 50.
yeah.
For different needs. So
Like
I'm
volunteer.
not sure it's a chicken and egg. I think the tabular came first. for
And how
one
much-
of these
yeah.
things. And then you figure out how it can be represented, because fortunately the spatial layers can change a lot.
And they
A lot
still,
of that point did.
and they still have that business need too, right? Like
Yep.
you have that data broken out. And I think, those unit IDs have been are prime examples, right? We've got, I think, one unit ID in California that can be under 12 different dispatch centers, right? So there's all of that.
Yeah, and then you get to the problem where you've got too much business data in the geospatial.
Yeah.
And you're trying to offload the tabular data from the
Yeah.
geospatial, because
So
you
you're
have geospatial people then doing the work of the business, so kind of have to find a fine line.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
So anyway, that was my idea going forward on how to look into it.
All right.
What I was gonna show, I think we.
Oh, you're gonna,
Well, I think we walked
what happened to the thing?
away.
She stopped sharing.
Oh, I see.
I'll start sharing again. But, oh, no, now it seems silly to go back to where we were.
Chris, thanks for your comments. It's really
Yeah.
good to think about.
Okay. So. I really like this slide when Tara found this somewhere and I was like, oh, I really like this for the organizational data, because there's been a lot of questions and there's a lot of moving parts, and it really fit. So at the last data summit, last time we looked in season 2 of this mini series, we presented a timeline with various and sundry bullet points. And it had some dates that were in there that I'm going to call fantasy dates. This is what we were like, if all the plans align and we have an eclipse and there's a, everything's cool, this is when everything is going to hit. Didn't quite work out that way, but we do have various elements that we captured from the last one. And then there's been various things that have come up that we have added to it, which is why it's kind of skewed those original dates that we had. So we're working through the flow, and one of the things that became apparent is that we're going to need to set up some monthly calls and work with the different application groups, so that we can, and I think of this, there's all these beautiful little bullet items, but I think of this as the meat and potatoes. This is where we're gonna be going through and identifying what the needs are of the various applications so that we can identify how they're gonna be able to merge together. Back to that statement that you made earlier, Rochelle, about solving a data problem here in one spot can potentially create problems for another. That's a fail. We don't want to do that. So the goal is to get this in a manner that we can integrate it to where everybody can be. They may not always get what they want, but they'll get what they need. And
then we just wanted to add to that too, that, so we've scheduled these meetings monthly now, and these are, like I said, we've got up on the board there. This is gonna vary. It's the agenda is gonna vary based on where we are and where we might run into roadblocks or challenges, et cetera. But we've got these meetings monthly, and I think Elise pointed out, she's like, that gives us like 8 meetings before we're supposed to be going live. That's just not enough time. She's absolutely right. And one of the things that we said, well, all right, let's add in every other meeting that it's going to be very specific to OIS, these edge, as far as getting through some of the things which you'll see on the timeline that they've requested for. So we're reaching out to the applications to get all of that information that's up there right now, just to make sure that we're covering it all, not missing anything in the timeline, et cetera. But we need to start giving them something though. One of the biggest questions we hear is, when are we going to have access to the API? When can we connect to the data and see what it looks like and take a deep breath that, okay, it is what we thought it was going to be, right? Oh, it's not at all what we thought it was going to be, and you're going to break my system. And so that's the one, I think one of the key points that we wanted to get across today, that is not the intent. We're not going to say, hey, Wolftis, or hey, Irwin, or whoever, right? We need you to change every single data standard or data element name that you have in your system, because we've changed the organization. And we're not going to do that. If there's a crosswalk that needs to happen in the background for this architecture, it will be behind the scenes in Edge, and that all of these systems are not going to all of a sudden have to change. My favorite example, government subdivision to agency, right? That'll stay the same in your system, and so we don't break anything in the process.
And so we're going to be having these calls, and we're going to be fleshing this information out, the meat and potatoes. And then this was our timeline, and we're working through it. But if you compare it to the one that we presented last time, you'll note that there's more bulleted items. As we've been working through the process and discovered, oh, that's going to be a factor. We're going to have to add that in here, and it would probably fit in this area. So that's where that's.
So on our first meeting, one of the things we asked is, what do we have missing from the timeline?
Mm-hmm.
What is missing? And we got some pretty good input from all of the systems, all the connected applications, and the systems cells, OIS and UnitID and Edge, and then of course all of our participating systems behind that. So this is evolved to capture that. You'll see it's much longer. There's again, we still don't have completed by times there, because what did you call it? Mystery. Fantasy. Yeah. So I think we're all aware of that. And the other thing is, we are working with the systems, not against them. So if they say, look, no, this is not going to work, and this is where you're going to break me, et cetera, that's why we're going to work together in that process. So this is some of the things that showed up on the timeline that might be able to, coordinate timelines for apps to develop and plan the transition, the connection, and workings of that API are key for the applications to start testing. What we don't even have Edge and well, actually, I don't know. Do we have Edge and OIS? They are reading the service. Edge is reading both of those services. So we're not necessarily in order here either, right? So it's like, oh, we were able to accomplish this when we didn't think we could yet. Oh, we can get this other piece.
Yeah.
Picking
away here.
We are reading both the UnitID and OIS APIs, but it is currently a manual process in ingest, just to see what all has changed and changing it into the schema that has been built in Edge. But we are pulling those updates Right now, I would say monthly. But we could certainly increase that up. But-
Yeah, but here's the difference between the two applications. OIS can hold things back, like the BLM came at us and added a whole bunch of unit IDs. They didn't want them available to IROC
Or fire code.
or fire code or anything. So we can hold those back in OIS. And all those PRIs that are in unit ID, those will never be in OIS because we don't want those coming into our systems because people will create incidents off of PRI. If it's there, they'll use it. And it's like, and so there's a lot of things we hold back so that it doesn't reach the users out there, because if they see it, they'll use it. I guarantee.
Well, and I think that comes back to the data model and how the reading systems are pulling that data in. We need all of that data in a centralized place, but we need whatever flag or something to say, don't use this for this use in this system.
And they should have historical data, and they still need it in the system.
Right, and in some systems, but not in
Yeah.
current systems.
Like, for example,
we
like
do
use
hold back.
ownership PRI in the 209.
We do hold back, and it's a discussion, like with the BLM, when we were working with the BLM, they didn't want it to be available to the field. So it's in our.
Available to the field in what?
It's
So it
in,
can only be used as a jurisdictional unit, and that's it. And that's where the flag.
But in IROC,
no.
in what? In what system?
Rocky Ice Week.
Any application.
in the
Okay.
application. It's only gonna be geospatially derived.
Okay.
Only time is right, so each one of these pieces, and that's why.
And so those are those use cases that need to be,
Yeah.
Exactly, so.
I can bring them into OIS, but I don't make them available to external systems.
Going on refinement with the affected applications, confirm applications are set up to read, write, data, et cetera, the operational acceptance testing. And then we had a couple, folks that said, "Look, maybe we should add this to yearly integration testing so we can see it. We can feel comfortable that it's working as expected, or wherever it belongs. Maybe it's not in integration testing, maybe it's in another place." And then, of course, this is the one that I think that challenges us quite a bit, is knowing when systems are planning any releases, contracts, schedule, all of those things. Because we're not all on the same, and it could impact one system to maybe go live in January, right? With some of these, and others like, oh, we don't want to wait until, April or whenever we go, like on March with Irwin, et cetera.
And this goes back to something Cole said, 7-year contract, not 10. So time frame
Exactly.
is going to be affected by that.
Ready?
The swirly with the, yeah. So, this is how unit identifiers are handled now, and we're not changing the process. This is a beautiful graphical illustration of what that process is and how it can be talked through as far as the organizational data and the unit identifiers go.
And then I think the participation, one of the biggest questions we get is, who is going to maintain this data? Gina, just kidding. And who is going to maintain this data? So we have processes in place, like the unit ID system has a process in place where you can see, number 2, where an agency, and each agency might have their own process. Like, for example, the BLM has a unit ID board, and they have to okay the request before it goes to the GAP custodian. There are other systems that goes right to the GAP custodian. The GAP custodian then, supposed to do some research and make sure that it's a legitimate organization, et cetera. And then they enter it into the system. It's not approved. And these are these workflows that Dawn and Gabriella are building into the system, where they can enter a request into the system, have the same sort of user interface. And this is that piece where it's not just a reference data set. There is some action that this system edge is going to need to be able to do. And that's what they're working really hard closely with folks that can help them on that top quadrant side or whatever. But so then it sits, and then the same process. There is a board, there is a organizational data, an NWCG unit identifier board that then says, yep, we're good to go. There's representation from each one of the agencies on those boards, the states, et cetera. Everybody's got everyone there. And then then when they say, yes, we're good to go, then Gina and I approve. Then once we approve them, the system that we have in place right now, it says now we can go ahead and publish it. And once it's published, now it's available for the other systems. So nothing's gonna change there. All of that's gonna be the same. It's just a new user interface that we would be going into. But I think the system that's in place is working as far as that process and the checks and balances are in place. And the limited access, right, Gina, that certainly not going to be open to everyone. Don showed us one of our first meetings. He showed this little shield that shows up on Edge. Basically means it's locked down. Nobody can touch this workflow unless your words are probably better than mine.
Yeah, the data cannot change, even by someone with admin credentials without a workflow process to track what changes were made and go through that approval to make those changes.
So any questions on that? I know a lot of you have heard this. We've kind of warned a few folks. This is very similar to what we showed, but we have a broader audience here that would be really good. And never sometimes heard things twice, because the second time around you may, oh wait, that's not what I would like to see. I'd like to see. So we thought we would share that again.
And I know in the past, there's been some confusion about this process, and I gotta confess, I just really liked the slide because I thought that it was pretty sequential, and it really showed the process in a graphical context where you're not just reading a page and a half of directions. So-
Threw away to that.
Yes, many are called, few are chosen. Not every one that is submitted is going to happen, and so that's why I trotted myself over here. And sometimes, an entity will put one in there, and that's like you're sitting on some because they aren't. The agency doesn't want them out available to application, but we also sit on some because until they've been approved, we don't want anybody in there, any application in there using them, and not all changes are accepted.
So Chris Stubble has a question.
Yeah, just in terms of, this is great. I see the flow, and I know you're going to put it into EGP and govern those terms there. Is there also a component where you can do, as you're generating the new unit ID, a crosswalk to a Forest Service unit ID, BLM unit ID, so you have the ability to kind of say, oh, this BHP equals BHF in the Forest Service or something like that? Is that part of the
That's where
design?
that's where I would like it to go, Chris, because then what we do is if we start bringing in the agencies IDs, so BLM has some FA codes, right? So their organizations have FA codes. And so what I want us to be able to get to, as that data is available through IDME and we're moving more into this analytic environment, it's like, I wanted somebody to be able to come in if they're working, if they're familiar with the interagency codes, because that's really all unit IDs are, right? It's an interagency code so it can be recognized across those agencies so that everybody doesn't have to learn parks codes and fishes codes, right? Yeah. But I also would want the BLM user to be able to go in and say, okay, I want to run this for FA units, FAs, whatever, and get the same data, right? That's the whole thing, is that we should be able to look at it from the interagency perspective and from the agency perspective. So eventually I want the agency codes in there and as much mapping as possible between the interagency codes and the agency codes.
And also, you show throwing the unit ID away. Not everything gets a unit ID, but maybe that organization still lives in there.
Right.
And that will still get a unique ID. All of the organizations will have a GUID. So it's may not the human readable unique ID like a unit ID would be, but everything at least would have the machine readable ID.
From the business perspective, they're not functioning in a capacity that utilizes a unit ID, but from a data exchanging perspective, they're going to need to have some way to identify them in order to exchange them between systems.
Yeah.
And the other thing I kind of wanted to key on there with what you were describing with the FA codes and all that is eventually goal moving forward, but not part of this initial implementation. And we're still on the baby in the diapers crawling. That's either a walking or a
That's our
running.
crawl, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so we're.
but at the end of the day, where we
Yes.
want to get is that,
Yes.
you know, it's like Fish and Wildlife Service has really good organizational reference data, right? And so where we want to move towards is that we're not actually even managing that at all. We're just getting it from them, right? And and so but there's a lot of transition for this community in that regard, because, you know, at one point in time, NWCG unit IDs were kind of the Wild West, and like, you know, they were being created all over the place by, you know, and not really reflective of the agency's organizational structure, right? Like, is this really a district, or you just kind of like decided you wanted to do that? And so we as we move through this progression, it's going to be that we're going more and more back to that authoritative source, and then it's like, and it gets easier for the org board as well, because it's like, where in Fish and Wildlife Service does that organization exist? You don't get an interagency code for it if it doesn't even exist in your organization, right? Like, so there's a lot of opportunity that as we move forward, and we have to be thinking about that. We may not be there yet, but that's where we want to get to. And not all of the organizations have that data ready for us. But Fish is probably one of the places that will start, just because of the way their organizational data is structured, to start learning on that in the crawl, in the walk phase.
Oh, before-
Yeah.
when you're-
And the Forest Service is definitely still working on that, on providing a service, map service. I'm not sure exactly what kind of API, but it's definitely on our radar, our authoritative codes and names, trying to get that so it's more easily shareable or accessible to Edge or whatever.
Susan has a
Okay,
question.
so
Susan has a question.
Or more of something pointing out, in the standard for unit ID, there is no dash between the state and the code. And, you know, we've all experienced that with the data. Can the very nice slide at least match the standard? And or did the standard change?
so I can fix that.
The display versus the
You know,
data.
I don't like the very nice slide. I'm just kidding. It's true. I will say this is a cultural thing, right? Culturally, our entire organization thinks there's dashes. And the way we exchange the data is without the dashes, but even some of our applications, we have to show it with the dashes, because that is what people think. So we went back and forth on that slide. So you're absolutely right, because I will tell you, in your incident number has a dash,
And if you see it painted
but
on
not between the
vehicles,
state and the board. It does.
It's easier to read too.
And it's easier to read, but no, it's a really fair comment, because what did John say earlier today? That he's got an application with USFS 3 different ways in his application. And so this is sort of that change is scary thing, but you're not gonna see fire truck out there without that dash. You
Yeah.
are not gonna see it that way.
That-
So
that's what they paint on them.
that's what they pay on it. So yes, the standard is no dash, but how we're probably gonna display it it's a tough one, Michelle. You can
The
run that
display
one.
versus the data.
Is the standard wrong?
This to me feels like, are we gonna put the forks all on the right side of the knife when we're setting up the room for the catering, or should we go ahead and just get the room set up and then sort out where the forks go later? And when we get to that point where we're able to display more, then we can stick with one or the other.
Well, I wonder, Steve, if this takes us back to that conversation we were having about date time. Because the date time conversation was, do we need a display standard? Not a collection, not a creation, and not a storage, but a display standard. And it almost feels like there's a display
does feel like a
standard for
display.
unit IDs that includes that
For readability.
for readability and.
Because we know how it's gonna get stored, But some applications want to display it with the dash.
Because this is our human readable
Yeah.
unique ID.
Right. And that would be a way to serve both masters.
Kind of like, here we've got two examples for a potential display standard. I think we might need to kind of,
There is a display standard. So the display standard is with a dash. The standard of exchanging is without the dash. So I think the standard is correct, but is that?
Was there a problem with this changing with the dash?
I don't want to do some more work. The system. You know what I mean? What is the juice worth of screen? So I don't know.
Well, it used to be a
Okay.
reserved character, so depending on who you were saving, you had to do, whether you had to
Yeah.
put it in single quotes, double quotes, backslash, percent sign or something to not do it, so that was one of the.
So here's where we are, and I apologize if this doesn't display the greatest. And I have had a couple of people ask me for this Visio, and I'm trying to change it as we go along. So I originally created this Visio a couple of years ago, and we started talking about the UnitID flow, and it was specific to UnitIDs. And so now we've updated it, right, to start talking about organizations. So you can see where, I won't make you read all of this, but when we come over to the traditional organization information access and which systems use that and which data in particular they're using within that system, right? And so, for example, this is not inclusive. I'm still working on it. There's a lot here to capture. But so when we're looking at IROC and we're talking about the incident specific data that these things that they get from OIS, right? Not inclusive. I know there's stuff missing. And then for resource attributes, this is the data that they need as far as owner unit, home unit, parent organization, office type, et cetera, provider unit ID, et cetera. So if we move down to traditionally how we use UnitIDx and we start talking about systems, this was really tough for me because I was like, I cannot figure out the most eloquent way to show it. So I'm just going to say right here, right now, we're talking incidents, procurement, and resources. And these are the systems that we're looking at that are associated with organizations in UnitID that lies within the standard that we need to make sure we make allowances for as we move forward, right? So you'll see we have a little bit more towards the bottom here when we're looking at my idea where I'm moving forward is the application, right? So everything that's in green right here are the CADs, and here's the UnitIDs that they use for incident record creation. And that's pretty easy, right? Because most of the incident record creation uses UnitIDs and then associates the information behind it. MTFNF, we know is the Flathead National Forest, but it's not out there. But adding what I'm adding over on this right-hand side is all the resource data elements that are applicable to them, provider, UnitID, dispatch center, et cetera, all those things that are associated with them. But the other thing that we're adding into this is how are these systems currently getting into the, how are these units or organizations currently getting into the systems? Some use the UnitID service just to validate. Some use the UnitID service, and manually finish, auto type the information in. So they're all a little bit different. But as we're looking to what we're going to need out of Edge, these are the things that we're trying to keep in mind. Like, oh, this is what's going to be used. This is how they've used it historically. And that's why we're so dependent on the applications to visit with us about it. So, so we come on down, we've got other systems that are, this is not next gen, this is with this classic, right? How they use the UnitID service, and how the updates happen. It's not very, it's manual, right? Inform, how Inform uses it. I've got a little line down here for EGP fence and WeatherX, et cetera. And if you move over, we see the Irwin, how they use it and how they update it. Just like this later. But how Irwin queries the system, they have resource unit identifiers contributing to resource data, they have incident creation unit identifiers contributing to incident data. That should say incident data. And then if we keep going, we're going to move over and start looking at more resources. Resource organizations, this is tough, right? I was like HEMS, Viper, EI suites. So we're talking about procurement, we're talking about finance, we're talking about contracts and resources there. So adding how they use what they're going to access for each system. And then of course the qualification systems and how they currently work. And of course, as we add new systems. So this is that piece where we're trying to really flesh out exactly what's used, how it's being used, when it's being used, how often it's being accessed. So we make sure as we move forward, when we're going through that check and balance,
Yeah.
then it all comes together.
We have that common ground. Super quick timeout. We still have more stuff to show.
Okay,
Leading into that time that was kind of originally set up for some working stuff. And so
that's okay. Keep
you're
going.
cool with that? Okay. So we're gonna keep rolling.
Yeah.
And,
And then everything is constantly changing, right? So we we're just chatting about the fact that as 209 starts to move towards resource data, as WCA starts to move resource data, Inform is gonna, get some information with resources, right? So they have these business needs that they've identified. But we just want to make sure that any sort of break, most of them are gonna be only what's being provided as far in the data set already is gonna come across. But we just want to make sure that we can say, yes, we looked at it. Yes, we know.
because we don't want to break somebody. It's our goal. Want to get that integration.
And then I guess that other little thing that I was showing earlier, so this is basically the same thing. In each application, what they're currently doing, who their points of contact, their recommended practice when they make those updates, and that's where I started to talk when Emmy was saying, and Gina, we're having that conversation that there's things that we need to make sure are done before we make any changes, right? So those folks, all of those applications we're trying to pull out. My plan was, I'll just add all of those units use, organizational use in this column as well. That might just be, it's easy for the applications to look at rather than a big busy of itself.
I think that's a good idea.
So, and then sharing this with all the folks on these meetings, right? These are all the conversations where, look, I have them in here, I meant to delete, I'm sorry. But as we share with all the different applications and sending this information to them so that they can let us know. There you go, Lauren, I still got you on CBS.
Yeah,
You got me on wires.
there's another one there that you need to edit. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have you on wires. All right, everybody. So I wasn't planning on showing this, but I still think it's valuable. I still think it's valuable if we update it. We can have this. That's good.
You need to edit, yes.
Yeah, probably. One's got a lot, there's a lot of information as far as how they make their updates, et cetera, as well. So it's a pretty good inventory. Let us know. We'll make these available to everyone. You can let us know if we missed something, add, change, new folks involved, et cetera.
Should we roll into the edge showing demo of OIS data, Dawn?
Well, I have a couple questions to the group at large. So we ran into a situation where the standards database was granting access based on the UnitIDs, the medical standards database. And so this weird thing started happening because of BIA's relationships with tribes. And so they wanted to create these essentially UnitIDs because that was how they were managing access. Because if they just gave it, I think somehow they were like giving tribes access through their BIA relationship because the tribe didn't have its own UnitID. And then BIA was like, well, that means the tribes can see all of the medical information for our units people, right? And so there was like all this weirdness around this. And I think it's like came back to the fact that access was based on an NWCG UnitID, which doesn't seem like that. I mean, I totally understand why they went that way because of the experience they have with it, right? But like from a data management perspective, that was not a really good code to have used yeah. And so so I think that highlights like how do we, is it that we need to put that in the standard for UnitIDs, but that feels like it's kind of an application portfolio thing. And so this is in this whole kind of conversation about like, how do we coordinate the data stuff with the IT implementation side of things? That feels like it should be a standard from an IT perspective that says, don't use unit IDs for granting access in your applications. And I see you nodding, Eric. So is that like,
But we have to,
What?
but we have to, yeah. I was gonna say, you'll shut down a bunch.
Yeah,
That's how I know.
yeah.
Give statusing their resources down to the ranger district or the.
Yeah.
Fire.
It's just a matter of, yeah, so to me, it more highlighted a gap that they had a need. They were trying to solve for, and we see this a lot in unit IDs where people try to solve
Yeah.
for an organizational issue or an application issue with unit IDs. They were never built to do.
so how do we help them discern that it's appropriate to use unit IDs for controlling access here, but not here? Because what I hear you saying is that there was a difference in what they were trying to do.
So they were using it, they were using the unit ID to grant access, which is probably okay, but there was some downstream Plingo chart there that said, oh, so that means you can do this, like access everybody else's data, which is not okay, right? Especially that data, which is definitely PII as far as medical. So, and the other thing too is, because then the ask was to, let's go ahead and change the agency associated with the unit identifier. So that doesn't happen. And that, of course, completely muddied the waters on those unit IDs, because I'm just gonna speak frankly, because it's easier for me.
Right.
I'm in fire. And so, that these are tribes, and that they were being associated with the BIA when they're a sovereign nation. And so, yes, we all know there's a relationship, right? We definitely know that, but there was drawing of lines and connections that were inappropriate. So to me, it was more their own architecture. The other thing too is,
But how do we help? Because you've got people that are just trying to do the best they can.
do a good job. Yeah.
And so how is it that we can, and I'm not expecting us to answer it today, but I think it is like, these are the complexities of how we think about creating a data structure is great. But if we don't know how we're going to implement it, or we don't have the partner guidance on the implementation side, like, that's how these little things happen. And we end up with these really weird situations where something we thought worked well here doesn't work there. And there's just like no place to go other than when it shows up and they're like, we want to create a whole bunch of unit IDs for organizations that don't qualify for unit IDs, right?
Well, it's
Sorry, she's better.
it's actually two issues, kind of. You've got a data issue, but the whole reason that data issue developed is really a business process issue, or a business rule issue, or a business usage issue. And that might perhaps be the better approach to provide guidance and documentation for this kind of a thing from that perspective, rather than from a data perspective, although they intertwine, not as impactful of an issue, but here's another example. In my previous life, I was the person that was dealing with ICDS, which is the caches program, management program. And within their cache management program, because they're a siloed application for the most part, they have a business need to be able to ship stuff from the cache to various and sundry helibases and ranger districts and all kinds of other places that, when I walked into that job, what they were doing is they had associated shipping addresses within that cache program with unit IDs that existed out in the system. And address A is not at all the same as address B. And so there would occasionally be things where they'd be going to data custodian, trying to get the address changed. And it's like, no, stop, cease. That's your need, your business need for a shipping address associated with that ranger district, which has nothing to do with the address that goes along with that data element that you have hijacked to put it into your program so that it'll pull all this information in. And so what they ended up doing was they created some standalone codes that are made up. They don't exist anywhere else. They're in the application. They're only going to affect that application, and that's how they're handling it. Works for a siloed program, does not work for a program that is going to talk to other people and interface and potentially utilize the organizational data reference set. So from that application's perspective, my suggestion was, well, sell all these publications to like colleges and random people out there that they're never going to have a unit ID. And that program was an off-the-shelf program provided for like, you know, where you could build software for like Home Depot if you wanted to. So there's a way to enter an address in there that doesn't need to tie to this NWCG unit identifier. Put your address in with that code and move on with your life. So it because they didn't know, they had a problem and they were like, oh, well, just use unit ID because unit ID fixes everything. And so they kind of went down this little rabbit trail. But that's a business process, is what their real issue was there. It really wasn't a data issue. And I think that's kind of the same thing here.
Well, it was an interesting one that came up, and just the impact of that. The other question that
Oh,
has,
will you let, before you move on, you know.
So just real quick on that BIA issue, it's becoming quite a quagmire in some cases because what they've done, some of those unit IDs were created inaccurately 25 years ago. They created them as BIA agencies when they were really tribes. And so now to get them to be switched over to tribe, because the name's already in my system, I can't bring them back in. So I'm gonna have to go change the name of the BIA tribe. So both of them can exist, the BIA unit ID and then the tribal unit ID. So in OIS, it doesn't like things if it's the same name because it says it already exists. We were able to do it in unit ID. I don't know how. You probably because it was only based on a unit ID, but it's the same name. And I was trying to
Give a different country code, actually.
no, not
Not with the tribes.
with the tribes. It was just a different 3-letter
I'm sure we
identifier.
reached out to anonymous.
So, but it's becoming quite a quagmire because I'm having to tweak the data in both systems to get both of them to come in, both the BIA unit ID that's been in existence for 25 years and now bring in the tribe because it's the same name. And it's like, it's kind of a mess. So
We fixed that in Andrew.
But I was gonna say, so big picture.
I was like, is that a system issue or
we
the
don't
data
have the
issue?
same names of organizations. We got to change the name because otherwise people will get confused if they see the same name for the BIA unit as well as the tribal unit. They have to be different. Otherwise, people will get confused.
You can't have duplicates.
No,
It's
you
a
can't.
validation issue.
It's a validation issue.
Yeah, because we worked through it.
It's the
Yes.
same name and
Yeah.
change their unit ID.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the last dispatch center changed their name and kept the same unit ID.
Yeah.
Which actually is easy. We can do that, no problem. But
Oh, they changed one word.
yeah, so it took out, so.
Steve,
So, and I missed a bunch of this, and this is an issue that I was one of the ones that was kind of dragging this into the spotlight, but I think my take home from this is that we've got different business needs. And it kind of starts with like, what's the atomic unit? So in the case of like jurisdictional protection, how we all have a sense of that, but Park Service has management clusters and Fish and Wildlife Service has management clusters and BIA's going to zones. So, that idea of like, well, there's an FMO that's at the field level that has some assets or gets some flyers on his place or a place or whatever, that concept's starting to change. And so I think the existing organizational data just needs like a refresh, but to start with like what are the business needs for that data? Because I think what we're going to find is that the answers seem an awful lot like they would be the same, like BIA unit ID and a tribal unit ID that has the same name. Well, I know what I'm talking about because I worked for BIA for 30+ years and, you know, you shouldn't change the name. I mean, if the tribe's name is Blackfeet and the agency's name is Blackfeet, that's what it is. So the systems need to figure out how to handle the fact that there might be two organizational entities that have the same name, you know, that don't, one's an agency and one's a tribe. But from a business need perspective, I would want to count those assets that are funded by the federal government, but fielded by the tribe, because those are kind of an extension of the federal government. But at the same time, I want to be able to go grab those resources out of the data set so I can identify which of those resources have been, you know, converted to a self-governance program, you know, through a tribe. So, you know, that idea of like who owns the resource, there's two answers to that question. We've got a system that's set up that can only answer, you know, only have one owner associated with the resource, but there's a business need for both. That's how you get this mess. Where, you know, somebody said, well, okay, just give the BIA unit ID to the tribe. No, you can't do that. You got to reassign one. Well, you know, all those answers, you know, really are necessitated in a business. So the other thing that's come up is that, you know, if you can figure out what those atomic units are, those hierarchical tiers as they go up, don't serve us well for all business. So we've got, you know, agencies that are specific to the agency if it's Fed, but if it's a state, you know, it's just Department of Corrections or it's Department of Natural Resources, but you know, Wisconsin's and Minnesota's get lumped together if you just grab all the DNRs. And so that idea of how these things kind of have additional hierarchical data that is associated with them, those don't really fit as well. And then, you know, I know Chuck's not doing anything next Tuesday, but you know, there are no data standards. There's a geospatial data standard, but none of this, there's a data standard for what a unit ID looks like. But like jurisdictional unit, protecting unit, there's no data standard. So.
Yeah, definition, no standard, right?
Yeah, formal data standard.
Yeah.
I mean, those terms have definitions,
Yeah.
they don't have a data standard. So I think we're kind of reaping what we sowed, which is, you know, we've had decades to kind of create these things, and now we're trying to get round pegs that square holes.
This would be occurring even if we weren't going to be pulling unit ID and OIS into one database. It's still an issue that we're going to have to address.
Well, and I think that trying to bring that together, right, is part of why, as we start peeling back layers, right, we start going, oh, this is why we've had all of these crashes and all of this frustration around it, right? Because there's this balancing act that we have to come to of there's an enterprise view and then there's this atomic user view, right? And we have to try and balance both of those, and the complete absence of one or the other puts us in a really rough situation. And we've been really focused in the siloed view, and we're solving issues for a particular purpose without having that ability to also pop up to the enterprise view and balance them back and forth, right? And so I have deep respect for the fact that we have application, like we want to minimize the effect on applications because of resources and funding and all of that kind of stuff. And on the other hand, I can say the structure that we had for our data, we had a federal hierarchy and we tried to shove everybody else into that. And if you didn't fit in the federal hierarchy, we'll just be uncomfortable, right? And what we have the ability to do now is really like the ontologies that Edge allows us to work in, then we can say, states, Kansas, how do you want to be represented? California, how do you want to be represented? You know, Blackfeet tribe, what, you know, like we can represent those organizations in different ways and then be able to cross that, right? And so
With some minimum required things. I see
Right,
some
yeah.
looks, some scared
right,
looks.
there has
Some interagency required
right
data fields.
there, but it's not like fire costs. I'm in the middle of fire cost standard right now, right? And so because we locked ourselves into the structure that said we have a cause classification and we have a general cause and we have a specific cause. And for natural, we have natural under cause classification and natural under general cause. And, you know, so you, when you look at it, you're like natural lightning, like, why is that? Why are we doing that? Right. But it's because we locked ourselves into a structure, right? And now we're going to loosen that up because we have different ways of managing the data. And I think the same thing is true of organizations. And so like as we, and organizations are just a reference data set, and we have other reference data sets that we're going to be looking at doing this with as well, right? As we start moving towards actually using reference data sets, it means that that there are going to be changes, and how do we balance? We have to manage those changes so that we don't just break everything. Like Lauren has said, we don't want to break everything, but we eventually want to get to this more, there's richer, denser data that is going to be available. And we are like, I just think we have to, that's part of this. How do we start thinking about how those changes start occurring? Because we can spend a ton of time and resources, like taking this really elegant structure that we have for this organizational data and then forcing it back into an old structure. And we'll do that because that's how we have to do this. But it's like, then are we going to maintain that forever? Or are we going to start maturing to these more advanced structures over time? And how do we actually do that as an organization that is so distributed and across the board? Like, you know, because as long as one application needs it in an older schema, then you have to maintain it, right? And so that's the type of thing I want us to start thinking about, like, how do we coordinate that? If the business has a need, we develop the standard, how do we support the implementation for the users to get the benefit of all of that work together?
And timeframe is going to be a factor too.
Timeframes of
Because we've got-
contracting is an issue.
Because we've got a desire to implement in January. That's 7 months away, 5 of which are probably fire season. And so we're gonna have to pick and choose.
Right.
What
I'm
moves
not
over, but
talking
it's
initial.
It's going to need to be addressed,
Yeah.
absolutely. But we're gonna need to figure out a time frame to address it. And get that done in a manner that works with.
We don't want it to
business
sprawl
applications.
forever.
Right, right, but. You know,
But we're gonna crawl
But
for a long time.
But to Lauren's point, like, we're lucky here, right? I don't think we have a set timeline of, maybe we do. I don't know when these applications are up for contract renewals or whatever, right? But there will come a time when it's like crunch time, right? And then that's when I think we get into these situations where it's like, we gotta get this done. We're gonna use the old system and hand jam it in. So
Yeah.
I think it's nice that Lauren's saying we're not gonna rush this, because that's not what we wanna do here.
Yeah.
Right? We wanna take our time and get it done right. Not only for combine, because we need to combine, like, yes, I've never said against that, but trying to rush that is not what we need to do.
you don't want to get painted into a corner contractually where you have to roll out your application before it
Some of
really
us
is quite ready for prime time. Because you clean that mess up way too long and no money is saved. You end up by being forced into doing something, and then all of this stuff happened, and now you gotta go and deal with all of this, and you're gonna spend the money over here. So it's sort of like painting your house. You can't expect the paint to, you're gonna have to do the prep and get it ready. And do it at the appropriate time, rather than just expecting the paint to hold it together.
Yeah, and the nice thing about Edge is that it doesn't cost us any more to put that organizational data in there or not. You know, I mean, it's paid for.
Yeah.
It doesn't, the amount of data doesn't change, the cost doesn't change, you know, so it gives us some flexibility that way. But also I think, you know, we've been talking about this for 3 solid years now. And so it's one of the reasons that we did kind of lay out some timeline last year is because we pay attention to the most urgent thing in front of us. And at some point in time, we have to make this urgent enough that we're putting some energy into it, or we'll be here in 5 years still talking about it. And I really don't want to do that because I actually won't be here, but
Well, to that point, we did talk about that same timeline in the fall,
yeah.
right? And we haven't seen much movement. I haven't anyway, so. We talked about it 6 months ago, and now we're back to where we were talking about it. We're at the same spot, so.
Yeah, I think we have moved. Because we are, like, all of the stuff that Kara showed, like, we have been collecting, trying to understand so that we can deliver the data the way that you guys have been getting it, so that we can meet that expectation. But part of it is like, it's a lot to try and dissect and make sure that we understand it, and also look at, okay, how do we deliver this? But we really want to evolve to this other schema as well. And so it's a balancing act. The structure Don will show you in Edge for organizations looks totally different because of the way that we can handle the data in Edge, and gives us a lot of opportunity for the future, but we just have to make sure that it works for today as well. So we've been trying to do all of that.
Should we have him?
Yeah.
Bring that up and then you can.
Also, I think there's another observation I make. Some of the stuff we do here is, most of the time we have the reason we started this discussion many moons ago was because there were those that felt that they knew that, gosh, this is a redundant thing. Why do we have these two things? It's so simple. Let's just combine them. We're done. Come on, just think of the easy ones. I mean, we ran with this, all these other systems, and it is just interesting to me. I mean, once again, is even we don't truly understand the complexity of it.
Yeah.
And while we all think of this, I think of Harbo. Because it's something, yeah, I mean, I remember the first Irwins. Irwin would take over generating it. This is silly. We'll just use it and we'll replace it with a GUI. And then suddenly you realize there's different systems to use it.
Yeah.
And totally matters exactly like this, that were never intended, never meant to do, but are filling a very important business need today. Turns out that this is very similar. That it's such a simple system. It's the same thing. It's just like, why did you come here from state, country thing and find out what state code is? Technically, it's concatenation of 3 fields. So dash is actually, they are separate fields. So we could go back to showing them the separate fields. So it is concatenation. So it's database. It is separate things. It's just we choose to throw in, whether we choose to throw in the hyphen or not. It's just separate. Anyways, my point is that once again, we have these people that have this perception. It's so simple. Let's just get rid of it, or let's just combine it. Let's go do it. And in the reality is, there's, I think we can succeed. But we did this one because this was the low hanging fruit.
They're thinking it's a round of balls, but yet it isn't. It's an onion. We're peeling back layers, and there's another layer. There's another layer. There's another layer.
Something's in our inventory. We could do these ones, get rid of them, show this. We can do that.
Well,
It's gonna get easier, like, once we get off our on-prem systems, like, once it's going to the cloud and things are more modernized, it's gonna be easier to make these changes. Because the system won't be so persnickety, or are we
Theoretically,
always gonna be behind? I don't know. I think so.
Well, I think we can keep striving. So
Yeah, the human element.
Pro striving, keep doing this. I just think that some of these, we just realize we may have all 3 of them for a while until we can eventually move people away from those constructs. And that just may be more of, it's going to be 3 or 5 more years or something. And one feeds the other, or it could be just some of these things take longer.
well, and I
We
think
would
that,
never have one hosting.
and the thing is,
Right.
like, if that's how we decide, like, if that's the reality of how we move forward, then we just all need to understand that, right? I think that's part of the challenge, is managing expectations about what we're actually going to do and how we're going to do it. And and if we're gonna say, the reality is that we're gonna function with 3 databases with organizational data for 2 years, then, you know, we can live with that. I think it's just, like, we have to really get to that reality point, and and we always want to be optimistic. I am the worst. My kids just always tell me, just because you wear rose-colored glasses doesn't mean the world is rosy, Mom. And so I'm always overly optimistic, and I need Cole and others to like say, really? But I also know that there is like we have there. Think about with Irwin, right? Like we built all these data standards and then they just kind of sat there. And when we got to Irwin and we wanted to implement them, then we went, oh, shoot, that doesn't quite work the way we thought it did when we were sitting in the conference room. And now we actually need this. So we actually need to put some energy into fixing it, right? Like there's value in urgency too, in us being able to focus because we have so many things going on.
It's just how it works. Is because we also couldn't make it. So we said, if you want to share data, and if you want to play it, then you need to meet the standard.
Yeah.
You didn't have to change your system. If you wanted to change it to share data, that's when you had to do the things. So like I said, there's ways we can do this. I'm not optimist for that. Can do these things. It's interesting because once again, we have so many different interests that we don't have any control over.
Yeah.
We can tell the state of California, you may not be aware of this, but it's hard to tell the state of California X and Y. Doing that. You know, but we see that with every agency in DOI. Besides that, when something DOI, it's funny. You choose them. You know, we've done that to our agencies. Silly things like Office 365. Holy cow, that's glorious that we have them now. Days when we had a new standard, it's going to be this. The word perfect people didn't want to get rid of it, so we have two standards. It's quite good again. So it only took us 15 years to do that. But anyway, my point is, yeah, I think we can. I think we can. It's just we can't wait for those that choose not to. We just set up the barrier and say, well, that's fine. Keep your little silo, do your own thing. But the moment you need to start sharing data, you must do it. And we can do that.
Yes.
With organizations of data. There is an overlap of need. You have, you need a different business. You have to do one of these sectors. You can eventually move into it. It takes easy 10 years to get better, so be it. But manage the other systems. And that's where we are since it's been formed. Every single agency's got to use it, except one chose not to. Did it anyway, and eventually through shame and embarrassment, they're finally coming on board. I mean, really, because it just made sense. It really, really did. But one agency chose not. Wait.
Yeah, I think that's a reality that we need to remind ourselves of, that we just operate in that. And it will probably never change.
We have these battles with IQS and IQS. Many people realize it's a different business. One's a centralized management, one's a decentralized. Same thing. Imagine that some states don't want to with their neighbor states. Some states don't want to play with federal government. So you'll never admit that you can't force them to in any way, even when we budget. Good. So that's the thing to do well. Exchange data between the systems, they both interactive, they can share the data level, do all those things, but they're never going to do.
That reminds me, at least I was thinking about your enterprise question, and I think that like that scope of enterprise, right, is always challenging. And I think that the way I think about the data management program is it's always focused on the interagency space. And so the enterprise is really that interagency, where the interagencies, where there's overlap, right, where those things come together, because every agency in wildland fire also has their agency enterprise. And so we're kind of that, we're the pie that has, you know, pumpkin pie, apple pie, berry pie, like fire comes in as this multi-flavored pie. And that's our enterprise that we're trying to work within, knowing that it connects to all of those other enterprises. So it's really interagency is the,
We're that selection in the store where it's cheesecake and each slice is a different one.
yeah.
Have that?
Yes.
I guess we got to get the store, you can make that right now. Make all this fun.
All right, so let's take a look at Edge real quick. Just so you guys can start getting a sense of where we're at.
Rocky stuff, but I'm taking Boise district because I know something about it, and if I mess it up, there's somebody in the room who can steer me right back to the correct one.
Gina?
Yeah, right. So that's why I picked this one. And it shows the way that the data is entered and structured, where I imported in.
Also, all of the red asterisks with the data model, we've specified for this particular type of organization, these are the required fields. And right now, let's see.
This is the draft.
It is
This
what
is-
it's in Edge right now. And it's a combined data set.
We'll continue to evolve as we have those meetings and discussions.
Yeah,
But this is where it's at right now.
to match what exists in the other systems, so that applications aren't gonna have to do a ton of recoding.
Yeah.
Work.
So both the systems are combined here, and if they met, it's just one record,
Yes.
and then, okay, so it'll be.
And a lot of that crosswalk was done with that unit ID
Yeah.
to bring those two together. So, like Kara was mentioning, we have the shield up here. It is a protected data set within Edge. All modifications must go through a workflow. If you were to even say, we want to create a new something, it automatically just jumps to creating, you have to do this workflow first.
2 letters, just right up there, they
I
say,
think
must
you
go
do.
through a workflow.
Now on, you're in a workflow and you can do everything and you submit it. Someone else has to approve it.
Yes,
Yes.
and it'll ask for all of the required based on what you are choosing.
This guy's saying it right there, the current asset collection is protected, asset creation must go through a workflow, realizing that this is little bitty type and it's a big room.
So the workflows, what that does is clone is the right word, but so you have a production value, right? So you have an improved standard and you want to do some work on it. In the workflow, you're working on a copy of it. So it doesn't affect anything that's approved or in production, but it allows you to go through and make whatever changes you need to make to it. And then once it goes through that workflow approval process, then it will replace the current one. And then we can track what supersedes something else so that we have that lineage documented clearly.
Yeah, it can be committed.
And so then you can see all of the assets within an existing workflow. And so you can see in here, you have full edit access to all of the different entities, save changes, and then that's still just stuck in the workflow until whichever level of approval for that particular something is met and pushed on to production.
A lot easier to back it out if it isn't committed yet. I learned that the hard way.
Like a draft.
Yep.
You can do anything in there.
Yep, I learned.
It's almost misleading, kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
Hey, it makes sense to think of it as a draft.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Creating a draft through the
Yeah.
workflow.
And someone else has to look at it to say, okay, this is good.
And even if they don't have to look at it, it's a good idea to get someone else to look at it, just in case, because that's what bit me. I thought it looked
Even yourself
beautiful.
later.
I thought it looked beautiful and somebody caught something, and backing that out was a little more complicated than it would have been if we had not committed it
Yeah.
first.
I know.
And so then you have that full history of here are all of the imports or changes or all the different things that have been done. Let's see. Sort of the other way. One that I did. So in here, could put a description of what changes you were making. And so that allows for that documentation of that note to future self. What
Yep.
was this change even doing?
Yeah, that might be something that, future data stewards, we have them do that, so it's easier to track.
I don't think we've ever been in a conversation where we went, I wonder what they were thinking 5 years ago when they did this, or 20 years ago when they did this.
I've spent time wondering, what was John Skeels thinking when he set this up?
And so in here, we have all, right now, we have addresses as a specific reusable entity. So in many of the systems, it's just address. And it's used for many different things. Now it's a reusable, distinct asset. We have talked about pulling that out of this one and making it its own collection. But maybe it stays in here. It just kind of depends on when you first bring it up. Everything's kind of shown all together. So, but that's going to be more for the data steward side,
Yeah,
which how that'll be best for those working in it.
and potentially standalone applications, if they have a potential business need, it may not affect everybody else, but it's something that affects them. If it can be added and managed by the data steward to add a third seasonal address or something, I mean, there's definitely possibilities there that are not currently available to us with
And
the
so-
existing system.
And so I would say everything you see here as far as a grouping, that is a shape. You can have your own, it already has an endpoint for these tier 3 dispatches. So we could bring that up and get all of the tier 3 dispatch information for all of our states, all of those, that's already available. It's just not in the existing JSON string that you are used to either through OIS or UnitID. What we're looking at is how do we make it what you are used to receiving already.
So there's rare cases that we have to restore something that was inactivated years ago, and then someone decides we want it back. And to restore it. Is that a capability?
So yes, so there is an effective start date and effective end date. As far as statuses, there's a last modified on. So all of those would be the different flags that could be used to deactivate something
Or reactivate?
or reactivate it as well.
Reactivating happens all the time.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's no problem. It's the reactivating something that's already been used.
They have a superseded, well, I don't know if this one is, but
yeah.
superseded by would be nice. Because you could supersede it by a new ID, right?
Yes.
So we can go back and look at what superseded what.
Well, because some old data was still tied to it, but then they deactivated like a dispatch center, and then they may want years later decide they want to reactivate it.
Right,
And with the same unit ID.
yeah. So that would just find what's.
I think it would be nice on that superseded, if we could have a date that happened too. So it's one thing to have, last decade. Let's say it was superseded a long time ago or whatever, because those dates seem to get lost in our current system.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's that logs when that superseded data was entered, and so,
I want to see it though.
Not the biggest logs.
yeah.
Well, the new one, it would say when it started, so you know, right?
So those are all those use cases we want to include within the model.
Yeah.
Let's see, we can do.
Because even right now, looking at some data that's in IROC, I'm running into the situation where I can tell that it's data that was pulled over from Ross because it's March of 2020 or whatever that was when that massive dump happened. But as far as when it actually came into effect, you just get to randomly guess because I don't have anything back earlier as far as when it was entered. It could have been entered at Ross like in 2005, you know, for all we know.
Yeah. Yeah, OAS or UnitID will.
No, it's neither. It's different data, different discussion and frequencies. Yeah.
Chris, units that would be under two different dispatch centers, would you try both? Or the systems just deal with it? An example, Northwest Land Office, Montana DNRC is in Kalispell and Hickey dispatch. So that would affect CAD systems, IROC, at 209, that would be under two different centers there, that unit, MT and WS.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Just a couple that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I think that's the nice thing about the edge model is that it allows us to have that type of flexibility. So if that's,
But what we need to understand about that is then what does that look like on the API side that systems are reading
right,
to make sure that it's either both or it's one.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, I'd want to know like how you,
Effective or just maintained in IROC as far as those relationships between organizations.
I'm just thinking if anybody went to Edge for data of this stuff, though, where's this unit? And there are at two different centers.
Right.
For tracking.
When you're saying in the center, I think you're talking about the.
Incident host and provide.
Yeah,
Provide
those relationships that exist.
Yeah.
That might be too big of a job to be managed in here for all of them, because not all the unit IDs we create go anywhere. And Kara, what, she has the numbers. There's like over 7,000 unit IDs and how many?
We've used 1,500.
Yeah. That's it. And so there's all these unit IDs out there, but not everybody's using them, right? Whether it's for resources or into for jurisdiction or anything. So they're just kind of out there. It's like Hotel California, I can say, but these unit IDs sit there and no one's using them.
Well, I think again, that's because people don't understand what we need them for and what we don't need them for. And I think when you were talking about business cases or even just the work that BLM was doing, the jurisdiction, they wanted a jurisdiction, they wanted an organization to show jurisdiction, legitimate ask, right? Because the way we have it set up, we collectively, they had to have a unit ID to pull it out on its own because the way their structure works, their districts are protection and their field offices are jurisdictional. We had to go through and add, and those were those ones that she was referring to before, but in actual fact, should have been able to allow a jurisdictional unit be the organizational name. So requiring all these different things. So when you talk about what we think we need and why we're kind of running up against these walls, and those are going to keep coming up, kind of like the one we were talking about before with the medical system.
so if we have 7,000 unit IDs and we're only using 1,500 of them, why do we have the other?
Our resource providers.
I want to say for the we looked under jurisdiction, really clear to see in geospatial data as far as protection and jurisdiction. And those were a little off, like one of them was 1,500, some of the other was 16. And then pulled all the resources, overhead equipment, crews, et cetera, that are in IROC. So we went that route instead of like through a qualification system. We wanted to get all of the equipment as well. And that is slightly larger. But we get these requests all the time that are like, a vendor. There doesn't need a unit ID, but during Wild West days, people were saying issuing unit IDs.
Because that's what everyone knew. That's how you play.
We're all trying to do the right thing. I mean, that's the thing. I'm not being judgmental at all. They had a business need and they didn't know how to achieve what they needed. And I think to your question before about how can we help support these applications that are trying to fit this gap? And that's exactly it. There needs to be some support from the subject matter experts on organizations, unit identifiers, and their appropriate use. Because we talk about it all the time. When people are creating incidences as PRI, you can't use private for an incident host because it has to be at least a jurisdiction, or that means it has to be a government entity. We do have private ownership, so we need to be able to call that out. People just misunderstand. And I mean, how many conversations in this group have we talked about the difference between protection and jurisdiction? At these points, we have definition, but it's a tough one to wrap your head around if it's not something that you're fully immersed. So folks trying to build an application, they can't be expected to know all of these, but they should invite us into the conversation, invite those people in that house, unless or have it in it, where it is completely laid out.
And we do have I don't really want to call it a bias, but it kind of is, because to this point, a lot of our interactions with the applications interfacing with each other have been more or less related to incidents. Now resources coming to the party. And so we've got a whole bunch of use cases that maybe work with some of these applications into the processes that involved jurisdiction and incidents. But now that we're involving unit IDs that are associated with resources, whole new set of mice that we've just turned loose in the room that we're going to be having to chase down.
When they display what?
Yeah. Challenges and would be the rosy.
Opportunities.
Yeah, the opportunities, new opportunities.
New opportunities for calendars.
Yes.
Fantasy world.
I like that. Okay, so. So I have another question that I'd like to just kind of like throw out there, right? And this, I think we've talked about this before, and Kara and I've talked about this a couple of times, with making this change to the organizational reference data. And I think it was one of the questions the IROC team had. So is it that we want to set up an environment where the applications are then pointing to Edge to get the organizational data and harvesting that independently? Or is there a role or a desire that Irwin have some part in that? And I don't know. It's just a question that's come up, and I think it is, I don't know, I guess I just want to kind of hear thoughts in the room about, like, what does that mean? Irwin is not currently designed to do that, so it would have to be a change for them. But is that something that we want organizational data to be exchanged in a different way than what we've been doing? And Kara, I don't know what thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, the idea, trying to find ways, it's part of this, what am I calling it? Retrospective, as opposed to like Asmin's check. It's part of the Irwin retrospective, where we can it was kind of fun for me to see that on your agenda, right? That we were looking at ways to support the application so that it can do less work. And so they can focus on their business requirements and not have to go through and do all this. So we were thinking about if we could have, if we were designing Irwin today, right? Rather than 12 years ago, how would we have done it? So those were one of those places where we thought there could be an area that Irwin could support that, rather than the systems that have to do anything for fingerprint. We all know how technical I am. So for me, it's this magical thing that happens in the background. Like David goes, "Kara can't do that." Or yes, we can do that. And so that's that piece that You know, and I always look at Elizabeth, right, because she tells me the steps. I have to do work with it. She is the developer for iRock, right? She has to do work with it. So it's better if Irwin doesn't mess with it. Or, yes, that would be great if you give it to me in these clear boundaries, et cetera. If I don't have to worry about that piece that I know is coming in. But it's kind of like changing your car from when we used to be able to work on the engine and now it's all a computer, right? So if it breaks, it's broken. Right? These teams work together all the time, right? We're on with each other all the time. And it's like, oh, that's broken. Is it us? You know, what is the deal? So there's that, but it just adds a little bit complex.
My thoughts on this too, kind of a little bit along with Kara, is there has to be some system, because right now OAS does stop things from going into IROC. But if we accept that unit ID in here, but we don't share it with it externally. Some system's gonna have to do that. If it's not Irwin, it's gonna have to be Edge, where you say that it can be shared with this application, but not this application. So that there's gonna have to be controls either way, either through Irwin or through Edge. Because we don't share everything with IROC because it's not meant to be a protection unit.
Well, when
That's
that's
right.
right, data info, sorry. Go ahead.
That's where the clear is depending on what you need it for, incident host versus resource provider. So all the integrated systems are lined up. This happened with, I keep looking at Megan too. Because there was a unit ID that, or an incident that was entered in SIT 209. It was in the unit ID program, but it wasn't in OAS. So the incident's sitting in Irwin, but it's not coming into IROC, so they can order resources on it. And then we've had instances with ICBS that they don't have the unit ID in that system because it has to be manually entered. And since Lauren left, there might only be a partial person that knows how to do it. But stuff has to be lined up in all the integrated systems for this to work.
But I kind of think a little bit, sorry, that as far as who I don't feel like Ed should be determining which system should get the data. The system should determine which data do we need.
Yeah.
Well, that's where.
Maybe but the role of what that unit ID should be used for is capture. And you query based on that.
But I think the role, when I saw an Edge, didn't have it tied down to the application because maybe fire code needs it, but we don't, or whatever.
Yeah.
or
It's not Edge's job to figure that out.
Right.
It should be the application's job.
Wouldn't it be in their handshake? I'm this role and then he's like, are you this role?
Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
check it.
Well, right now, I can manage it in OAS. IROC doesn't figure it out. It's just managed in OAS. When we were working with the BLM, they said, don't move these over. Consume them, but don't make them available to external systems. So I didn't. So I
So
said,
maybe at the data storage level.
so all I'm stepping, well, it would be Edge then.
Well, and that kind of goes to the expertise, right? You know, that
Yeah.
goes to the level of expertise of whoever's managing that data. We talked about it, right? It can be managed in Edge, right? So we know that when we create it, just because we're the ones who are in it right now, until we retire tomorrow, but we know, you know, who's in there and what this one needs to be able to notify. I know that this one should not. It should, and these are the reasons why. And those are the business rules.
Yeah.
that we need to write into the application instead of having to rely on Gina and Kara's brain to do that action, right? So those are those things that we want. But I think you're absolutely right. The reference data set indicates what it is, and then Irwin can help with the validation.
Well, and I think
Make
so.
it more into that business rule thing.
So Rick has had his hand up for a
Oh, sorry,
minute,
Rick.
so.
No, it's okay. I understand the pain of trying to deal with a few folks remote and folks have a lively conversation in the room. So I'm going to put bottom line up front and say trying to serve this through Irwin is a terrible idea. And I say that, okay, here's an example of why. We need the unit ID service for the spatial fire planning service where units can host their policy guidance for their unit. For federal units, that could be a land and resource management plan or a forest plan or any number of things like that. But it is not limited to them. Counties could have directions that they have. States have data in there now, lining out some of their sideboards and objectives for fire management. those are things that are not in any way tied to anything that we have in Irwin right now. It's not tied to resources. It's not specific to an incident. It's got nothing to do with responder history, unless you want to take and multiply the fields, the whole kind of spheres that Irwin is involved in. It makes much more sense to go to Edge to do it, to have that authoritative list and just have applications that need to access it from there. And absolutely, Irwin might be one of those because, being able to validate that records that come in have a valid unit ID be a great thing, but that cannot be the only access.
Yeah, and I don't think I would want to make it the only access, but I was just curious, like for the applications that are connected, if there was core organizational data that it would be easier for them to extend the connection to Irwin and not have they would essentially be dropping like they're currently going to UnitIDs and the Irwin API, that maybe we could take that one API away if they could get the data that they needed through Irwin. But I think there is complexity in how each of the applications use that might make it really hard for Irwin to be that source, just because we have such a variety of information from the UnitIDx and those services, and then the OIS services different, and that it might be too much.
Well, and I think about it in terms of like Irwin's got validation, and then some of the systems have their own validation.
Mm-hmm.
We would really like them to match, right? But there might be something different that each system needs to have. But the example that they gave earlier was a great example, right? We also have, active and inactive resource qualifications coming through right now that were valid, but they're not active, right? So IROC has to code for that. But we could have already made a resource order in a CAD, right? To see how it's come through. And then they're like, well, that's not. So we'll have to have some sort of validation, just checks and balances kind of thing. But at the same token, we can get that into the data.
Just want the repository for what is what someplace, so it's not just people's knowledge and one system's knowledge that it is. If we're going to be a true enterprise data standard on stuff that's held somewhere, and new systems coming on board know what's truly active, what's not, what belongs here, what is this. Do I use a fire department for a host unit ID, or is that a resource? It's got to be held somewhere other than people's minds and in certain systems.
We should add this. We should add this to those unit ID.
Well, it's figuring out the metadata, the attributes, right, that would allow an application to go, okay, I only want unit IDs that are, or I only want organizational data if they have NWCG unit IDs that are incident hosts, that are, like that they can go through and really hone in on, okay, there's this great big set of organizational data, but I only want this one subset based on these filters, right? And it's making sure that we have those attributes and that they're clearly understood, so that the applications can then get to only what they want, and they understand what it is they're getting, and it's trusted because it gets managed once.
I'm bouncing back to the thought of the organization data. Is that there's a lot of references to organizations within the data are currently done by unit identifier. Or in cases, some cases where they don't have a unit ID, then it's an organization name that we're kind of storing, right? And things could change. So I'm just kind of wondering, would there be benefit in Irwin to actually have organization data so that you're actually sharing IDs? Okay. We are, right?
There is a GUID attached in Edge.
So we would just use the Edge.
So they could do it and not have to worry about that change. And it's kind of what we were talking about, like earlier on, right? That GUID solve for.
Yeah, I think getting that ID, like, then if that changes, it doesn't matter.
And we still have to rule, right? You can't all of a sudden start using the same unit ID that was used 20 years ago and we sort of mess with. whatever, the data that could or should be associated with it unless we can query on acted during this time. Not known to do that, right? I mean, that puts a whole lot of buts in there. So we still need to have some rules. We can't have a duplicate. And if it's existed before, right now, the way the systems are set up, we know this, good, bad, or indifferent, we cannot make the change in one system. And it was intentional. It was intentional to try to prevent any bad data. But we see use cases that we brought up today.
Yeah.
I mean, going back to what Dawn was saying, make all the organizational information available to all the applications. That's where I can see we can get sideways, because all those privates are going to be available to IROC, and I can see somebody tying things to all those private unit IDs for every state in the nation. So,
Well, I think that's just working with Elizabeth and saying, for this field, you use this type of wildland role. They are a host. They are a resource provider. They are and the privates would not have that role assigned to them. And so it's not so much in the data you're assigning to application, you are assigning the role that is able to play.
And it's kind of how, I mean, there's data right now that applications filter out of the Irwin API because they only take, particular fire types. All of that information is available in Irwin, but you may not want prescribed fires. You're only going to take wildfires, or you may not want pulse, right? And so that's the power of, here's the platter with all the data on it, and you get to choose which data you want.
For your business case.
And today you might choose the chocolate, but tomorrow you could come back and get something else, right? Because all of that data is still there. And that's really what we're trying to get to, is how do we make all of that data available with the right attributes so that you can decide which you really want and trust that. So. Oh, Steve, sorry.
Well, it's embarrassing at this point. I didn't understand the question. We'll talk about it in 10 minutes, but I kind of had some things that came to mind. So the first thing was you said, Michelle, do we want to do data exchange with reference data set? Data exchange with reference data set, or is that always a poll?
Well, I think the question is when we have reference data sets, do we want to always say the only way that you can get that reference data? So let's say we've got all kinds of legacy, right? But let's say, in 5 years, we have Edge and there's like all these reference data sets in there. Do we want to say, always go to Edge as any application, always go to Edge for reference data and pull that from Edge? Or do we want to say, maybe there's value in having Irwin pull some of that reference data and make it available in the Exchange environment so that an application could get it another way because they're already connected to Irwin? It's a question that's been floated and I don't know the answer. So I just wanted to hear thoughts about that, because.
So, my thought is keep it simple. And if there's, a reference data set, go to the reference data set to get the data. Conversation kind of implies that there would be appropriate subsets of the data depending on the application or the business need. That's absolutely true, but it seems like it's a potential problem if we start constructing those data sets and stashing them even in the Exchange environment, convenience, because that's still, kind of a variant of a reference data set. And it feels to me like extract. I do think that the caretakers of the reference data sets probably bear the responsibility to work with the applications and say, let me help you build a recipe for a data extract and the API for your business. As you described it to us, you guys don't want archaic unit names. Might want, or whatever the case might be, but that could probably minimize some of the potential. The keepers of the reference data said, here's a good query to fit business needs as you've described. That doesn't necessarily constrain them to that, but at least it gets them, headed in the right direction and probably just So the other thing I heard, I haven't thought about this, maybe there is a data exchange, because it sounds like maybe there's some gatekeeping occurs to the reference data itself. And that we're also interested in the metrics of like who and how and when those reference data being paid. And so that idea that like, oh, something that's coming upstream to the library, you know, has to actually go through some form of checkout process. You know, I hadn't really thought about that, but I guess in a way that implies that there would be a data exchange. You know, the reference data edge in this case, perhaps would be monitoring like what kinds of queries are being submitted when, and maybe.
And so that comes back to how much of this do we have as an open JSON, you know, similar to what UnitID has versus issuing system credentials for people to go and pull. And maybe we have that baseline open JSON that anyone could use, but we issue system credentials and they could do any of their other queries if that public open JSON doesn't fit.
Since then. It's a possibility where NARIS competitive. We're looking at an Emmy spec for 26,000 fire departments with all the relationships between every other department, every station, every unit, every staffing. To add to include, you know, any other entity type. So the way we describe it is an entity can be anything, right? It can be a fire department, it can be a state fire marshal's office, it can be, you know, any of these intergovernmental agencies. And we're already planning to share this as an API feed out, depending upon your authorization. So depending upon the level of user access you have different access level to hit query fields on our API. So we could be the hub of all this information. We're going to sit on a lot of it already anyway. It's going to be public and free.
I think we had expected or hoped, we had been hoping that that you guys would be the source for those fire department IDs.
Yep.
Because in the past, some fire departments got NWCG unit IDs and some didn't, and it was, you know, it's been challenging. So if you guys had that reference data set, we would want to incorporate that with our agency data as well. And so I think there's definitely an opportunity for us to work together on that, and we would love to have those fire department IDs or something else besides NWCG unit IDs.
Because that's been the problem with fire department IDs all along, is they're not maintained, they're built and then left to the corner. They've never been maintained, updated, any of that information.
Yes, when an organization signs up, they're going to sign the NARIS ID ordinance. Apparently, it's not all encompassing. I'm learning by the day. And then we'll maintain that ID as part of it. So if you're active, or if you merge, so if two departments become like a larger fire protection district, they would get a new ID number to represent that fire protection district versus their legacy systems, but there would be the superseded by those relationships with stack. Same thing with parent-child relationships. We're maintaining those from a volunteer inside of a career department construct. And then as far as stations and units, it's all getting updated. So we'll have quarterly updates basically back to the administrative user of that department, much like we do with anything. A lot of the other services, it's okay, is please check and confirm all of this information is still accurate, up to date. If you're not up to date. And then for connected CADs and RMSs, we'll know if those unit IDs, if they're coming already in the system. So if that unit hasn't been established, that call will get flagged and won't be able to be verified in their system until that unit has been updated in ours. So
just not to be the devil's advocate.
yeah.
But does that mean all that somebody has to do is, I read the agreement, agree, right? Like how we do every day when we go into fire nets.
So for a big department like FDNY, that's several hundred, it's going to be quite it's in numbers. So we've got to work through some of the few items, but it's not gonna be a single click and confirm, so that everything's.
So it'll no longer be like gatekept by each individual state fire marshal or whoever was assigning the FDIDs.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes,
It's-
if a department does not exist currently, so if they do not have an FDID, the kind of authentication that a department actually exists, and should exist, will default back to the state fire marshal's office to confirm that, yes, they are actually a fire department. Because we won't have that authority within the state, but we're gonna assign the ID. So it'll be a federal assigned ID number, so you don't get duplicates. That's a big problem, right? Where like, I think Goshen, Ohio, and PG County, Maryland, or Fairfax are the same FDID. So that presents a real problem in data involved.
Because it. Check, right? Oh, detection check is on the screen.
Yes, that's why it's occurring at the nearest level.
Okay, so, so I think that's an important conversation as we are thinking about how we exchange data with NERIS, and as you guys are going, great opportunity to just like, how do we even coordinate on that one little data set? So really glad that you've been here for this.